The civil rights movement in the 60s looks a little different from civil rights right now because of, I guess, the goals that they were going after like 40, 50 years ago. So it was mostly probably about things like segregation and like lynching and who lived like the living experiences of black people in the United States. But the way we look at civil rights and particularly involving race has changed just because what the things that we're going after have changed. So we're maybe not looking at segregation in the literal sense, like it's not as common to walk in maybe a school or like a public facility and see like actual segregation of the races, but it has transformed in a different way. So you can think about modern day segregation in public schools. So the idea that students of color will typically be in certain classes versus their white counterparts being in higher level classes, which goes, and it's all connected to like socioeconomic status and how that affects students who are getting an education. I think modern day social justice is a lot about identity and individualism, whereas the 50s and 60s was a more type of a collective type movement. So because their goal was so collectivist and it was like, we want black people to be liberated, it never really got around to being specific. So it wasn't like, we want black people to be liberated and that means women too, and queer people, and like trans people, and the disabled. It was more like, us as black people, we should have one goal in mind, and that is the liberation of black people. But it's not taking into account that a lot of those experiences are going to be different because not all of them in the community are the same people. When I first came here, I was like, wow, I think this place is great. And then as like my first year progressed, and even till now, I'm kind of just like, wow, this campus really falls short of doing the right things sometimes. Um, I think this year there were a few wins, if you will, like the statues in West West Mall or South Mall being taken down. But in other ways, this university just doesn't do a very good job of making their students of color feel very welcome, and which is pretty disappointing considering UT loves to brand itself as diverse and like we know we have people of color here. They're sprinkled in there, somewhere in there you'll find them somewhere. But and diversity can be kind of useless if it's not inclusive. So even if you have plenty of people of color on campus, if they don't feel welcome, then what's the point? In some senses, it has changed, um, but not so much because I feel like even modern day black social justice is very still like we're all experiencing this the same way, but we're not actually. And a lot of times, it is actually the poor and the disabled and women and the queer and trans black people who are at the front of the movement, but a lot of times they kind of get pushed to the back, even though are mostly doing a good portion of the work because it affects them the most. It's not to play like the oppression Olympics, but when you put the most marginalized at the front and prioritize their problems, it actually does help. I feel as though it helps everyone and it puts them in the spotlight and it makes people more aware of what is happening in those communities and people who are typically affected by it the most. I would probably make sure that there are a lot more spaces for black students on campus, and not just about making sure there's spaces, but making sure that they're inclusive. So, like inclusive of queer people, queer trans, specifically queer black people and trans black students on campus. When I go out to black events or um, whether it be like centered on social justice or if it's just like a party event, it's like they're not going out of their way to be exclusive in any way, but they're not trying to be inclusive. So that can be just as small as like, okay, we're in a meeting for the black community and no one starts by saying pronouns or no one's inviting queer speakers or even having the conversation of like transgenderism in the black community. And so when you're not talking about those things, it kind of seems like you don't care about it.